I went camping alone last weekend. It wasn't my first time, but this trip was different. I picked a spot far from any popular trails. I wanted to get away from everything: work, people, noise. Just me and the quiet of the forest. That's all I needed. Or at least that's what I thought. I found the perfect place, deep in the woods. No cell service, no other campers around, just the sound of the wind moving through the tree and the occasional bird. It was peaceful, but there was something else too. Something I couldn't shake off from the moment I set up my tent. The air felt heavy. I told myself I was just tired, that maybe I wasn't used to being this alone. The first night was fine. I made a small fire, ate some canned food, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I woke up a few times, hearing noises outside, rustling in the bushes, cracking twigs. Probably animals, I thought. There's wildlife everywhere out here. Still, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. The second day, things started to feel stranger. I walked around, collected some firewood, and explored the area. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were fresh, maybe a day old. I say old, but definitely not mine. They were large, too large for any animal I could think of. They circled around my camp as if someone had been watching me while I slept. My heart raced. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing out of place. No one. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe they were from an old hiker or a hunter passing by days ago. Still, I couldn't get it out of my head that someone was out there, watching me. I spent the day restless, looking over my shoulder more than enjoying the scenery. I should have packed up and left right then, but I didn't. I wanted to believe I was safe. By the afternoon, the feeling got worse. It wasn't just the footprints anymore. I found my water bottle a few feet away from where I had left it. My flashlight, too. It was on the other side of my tent. I was sure I hadn't moved them. It felt like some kind of twisted game, like someone wanted me to know they were there. I yelled out into the woods, hoping for a response, but the only answer I got was silence. A thick, suffocating silence. As the sun started to set, I debated leaving, but it was already getting dark. The thought of wandering the forest in the night scared me more than staying put. So, I made another fire, sat by it, and tried to keep calm, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves felt too close, too deliberate. When I went into my tent, I made sure my knife was within arm's reach. I could hear footsteps now, not far from my campsite. Slow, careful. Whoever it was, they were making sure I knew they were there. I peeked out of the tent, scanning the edge of the firelight, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped every time I looked. I stayed awake, waiting, listening. The fire was dying down, and that's when I heard it. Something touching the fabric of my tent. A faint brush at first, then a light scratch. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. I grabbed my knife, gripping it so hard my hand hurt. Then the sound came again, this time louder, closer. Suddenly, I heard it. A sharp, ripping sound, like someone cutting through the side of my tent. Without thinking, I slashed at the opening, stabbing into the darkness. I didn't hit anything, but the sound of footsteps quickly retreating followed. I stumbled out of the tent, holding my knife, looking around in the dim light of the dying fire. I didn't see anyone, but I knew they were out there, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, staring into the darkness, daring them to come back. But they didn't. They didn't have to. The damage was done. My mind was broken, and I was too afraid to move. I waited, counting the hours until the sun would rise. When dawn finally came, the relief was overwhelming. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, never taking my eyes off the woods. The feeling of being watched never left. It clung to me, Even as I began hiking back, every noise made me jump. Every shadow made me think they were still there, following me. Just before I reached my car, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. That's when I saw it, a small object hanging from a tree branch. It was my flashlight, the one that had gone missing the day before. I had packed it up this morning, but here it was, swinging gently in the breeze like a final message. I didn't take it down. I didn't want to know what it meant. I just wanted to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But even now, back in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Like whoever was out there didn't stay in the woods. Maybe they followed me home. I'm not sure why I'm even posting this, but I need to get it out. Maybe writing it will help me make sense of what happened. Or maybe it won't. Maybe it's not supposed to make sense. Last weekend, I went camping alone. It's not the first time I've done it. I like the quiet, being away from people. My job has me dealing with too many faces every day, so I need to escape sometimes. The woods, the silence, they calm me down. I set up camp in a spot I found last year. It's far off the main trail, surrounded by thick trees, and no one ever goes there. Perfect, or so I thought. I'd been there for a few hours, gathering wood, setting up the tent, the usual. When I went a bit further from the camp to look for more firewood, that's when I found it. An old, dirty backpack. Torn in places, like it had been there for years, but something about it seemed wrong. Too fresh, maybe. Curious, I picked it up and checked inside. Most of the stuff was gone or ruined. Just some trash, maybe old clothes that smelled terrible. But there was a note, just a small piece of paper folded up. The words on it were short, but they hit me hard. Don't trust them. I didn't know what to make of it. Them? Who was them? Was this a joke? Maybe someone had been camping here before and left it behind. I figured it was some old prank and stuffed the note in my pocket. Weird, but whatever. It didn't feel important at the time. As the sun started to set, the forest got quieter. More quiet than usual. I shrugged it off at first, but it was odd. No wind, no animals moving around. I tried to focus on making dinner, but I kept glancing around, expecting to see something between the trees. I told myself I was being paranoid. My mind was playing tricks because of that note. After dinner, I sat by the fire, trying to relax, but the sound of the fire seemed too loud, like it was the only sound in the world. And then, faintly, I heard rustling in the trees behind me. I stood up quickly and turned, but there was nothing, just darkness. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I kept hearing those tiny sounds, branches snapping, leaves crunching, but whenever I looked, I saw nothing. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made me jump. When I finally drifted off, it felt like only minutes passed before I woke up again. The silence had returned, and something was different. I got out of my tent and saw it immediately. Footprints. Not animal prints, but human ones, circling my camp. They weren't mine. I could tell because they went right up to my tent, and I hadn't walked there. My chest tightened. I remembered the note and pulled it from my pocket. Don't trust them. The words felt more real now, like a warning I hadn't understood. But who was them? I scanned the trees, trying to see if someone was out there. For a second, I thought I saw something. A shape, a shadow between the trunks. But it disappeared before I could make sense of it. Someone was definitely watching me. I panicked. I packed my things as fast as I could, barely thinking straight. I just needed to get out. As I moved through the forest, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few steps, I heard twigs snap, like someone was walking right behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. My heart was racing, and my legs felt heavier with each step. I tried to stay calm, but the sounds wouldn't stop. Footsteps, whispers, like someone was talking just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded close. Too close. I sped up, walking faster, but it didn't matter. The sounds followed me, keeping pace. Eventually, walking wasn't enough. I started running. My backpack felt like it was dragging me down, but I couldn't stop. I stumbled over roots and rocks, falling more than once. And each time I fell, I felt like they were getting closer, whoever they were. I glanced back once and saw them, or maybe I imagined it. There were figures moving between the trees, but I couldn't make out faces. They stayed in the shadows, like they were playing with me. The note was right. I couldn't trust them. I couldn't trust what I was seeing, hearing, or even thinking. I ran until my legs gave out. When I reached a small clearing, I thought I was safe. For a moment, the sound stopped. The forest was still again, and I tried to catch my breath, hands on my knees, trying to convince myself it was over. But then I heard it. Someone was behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but I had no choice. The voice was close, almost whispering in my ear, telling me it was too late to leave. The words were slow, deliberate. I spun around, heart in my throat, but no one was there. That's where it ends. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. I don't remember. I just know I woke up in my car, parked at the edge of the forest. My camping gear was gone, except for the note. It was sitting on the passenger seat waiting for me. I don't know who was out there, watching me. I don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go camping alone again. I didn't want to go camping, but my friends insisted. It'll be fun, they said. Just us, away from the city for a few days. I went along thinking it'd be peaceful, a break from the usual. But if I'd known what would happen, I never would have agreed. We were 4 in total. Me, Sarah, Mike, and James. We decided to hike deeper into the woods to find a spot away from other campers. The trail was long, winding, and I was already regretting it halfway in. Then we saw the cabin. It stood there, old and worn, but not completely falling apart. The wood looked gray with age, but the windows weren't broken, and the roof seemed intact. It looked like someone still took care of it, though no one had been around for a while. Mike suggested we take a look. I didn't want to, but I didn't say anything. That was my first mistake. The door was unlocked, so we went in. Inside, it looked like something had happened recently. Furniture was overturned, broken glass scattered across the floor. It didn't seem right. James joked that it was probably just a bear or something, but the way the chairs were knocked over didn't feel like an animal's doing. The air smelled stale, like no one had been here for days. Then Sarah found the list. It was on the table, a crumpled piece of paper with names written on it. I remember her laughing at first, thinking it was some kind of guest book or prank left by other campers. But when she read the names out loud, our laughter stopped. Every single name on that list was ours. We all stood there, staring at the paper, not sure what to say. My heart was pounding, and I could tell from their faces they were as freaked out as I was. Mike tried to play it cool, saying it was just a coincidence, someone playing a joke. But none of us really believed him. "We should leave," I said. My voice sounded weak, even to me. But Mike and James thought it was no big deal. "It's just a joke, dude," Mike kept saying, though I could see the nervous way he kept glancing at the door. Sarah didn't say much, just nodded, but her face was pale. That's when we heard the snap of a branch outside. It was small, barely noticeable, but enough to freeze us in place. Someone, or something, was out there. We stayed silent, listening for any other sounds, but everything was still, too still. James suggested we leave right away, pack up and go back to the car, but as soon as we stepped outside, I could feel eyes on us. Every step we took, it felt like someone was watching, following, though we couldn't see anyone. Shadows flickered between the trees, but whenever I looked directly at them, they were gone. Maybe it's just the wind, Sarah whispered, but we all knew better. It wasn't the wind. The forest felt alive, but not in the usual way. There was a sense of being hunted, like something or someone was waiting for us to make a mistake. We reached the cabin again before nightfall. Going back through the dark forest wasn't an option, so we decided to stay inside, thinking we'd be safe with walls around us. That was mistake number 2. We blocked the door with a heavy chair and searched the place for anything that could help us. That's when Sarah found the photos. They were hidden in a small drawer in the back of the cabin, old and faded. Each one of us was in those photos, taken from our campsite earlier that day. Things from our bags were in the pictures too. I felt sick, realizing someone had been watching us the whole time, following us without us even knowing. Panic set in. Mike started yelling, accusing James of setting this whole thing up as some sort of twisted prank. James denied it, of course, but the fear in his eyes made me wonder if he was telling the truth. The tension between us grew fast, and before long, we were all shouting, pointing fingers, desperate for answers. That's when Sarah went missing. One moment she was sitting in the corner, quiet and shaking, and the next, she was gone. We called her name, but there was no answer. The door was still blocked, but the small window at the back was open, just enough for someone to squeeze through. Mike wanted to go outside and search for her, but I could barely keep myself together. Everything was falling apart so fast. We split up inside the cabin, searching every room, every corner. My hands were shaking, and every noise felt like it was right behind me. Then I heard a scream, sharp and sudden. It was Mike. I ran towards the sound, my heart in my throat. I found him in one of the back rooms, standing over someone. It was Sarah, her body limp on the floor, eyes wide open but seeing nothing. Blood covered her neck. Mike was standing there, breathing hard, a bloody knife in his hand. He looked at me, his face twisted in something between fear and anger. "I had no choice," he said. "She was coming at me." I backed away, unsure if I could believe him. It didn't make sense. Sarah wasn't violent. She wouldn't attack. But then again, nothing about this place made sense anymore. I grabbed the nearest object, ready to defend myself, but before anything else could happen, James appeared in the doorway. His eyes locked on Mike, and without a word, he lunged. The fight was quick, brutal. I barely remember it. When it was over, Mike was lying on the floor, unmoving. James stood over him, breathing hard, looking at me with wild eyes. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, like we were the only two left in the world. We ran. I don't remember how long we ran or in what direction, but somehow we made it out of the woods. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes I wake up at night, thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. I wonder if someone's still watching, or maybe I'm just imagining it. I've always liked the quiet. There's something about being alone, surrounded by nothing but nature, that makes me feel calm. So, when I decided to camp by the lake, I thought it would be just another peaceful night. I needed the break. Work had been stressful, and the city was getting too loud. The lake was far from everything, miles away from the nearest town. I set up my tent by the shore, the water still and dark, reflecting the stars. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft lapping of water. It felt perfect at first. As I lay in my tent staring at the roof, I felt that strange quietness pressing in. It wasn't exactly peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, but I shrugged it off. Being alone can mess with your mind sometimes, and I was just too tired to care. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, thinking nothing could ruin this moment. But something did. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. I just lay there. eyes wide open, listening. That's when I heard it. A faint cry. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bird, but as I listened closer, it became clearer. It wasn't an animal, it was someone crying for help. Help! Please, help! I sat up, my heart pounding. I could hear it coming from the direction of the lake. My first thought was that maybe someone had fallen into the water, or maybe their boat had tipped over. But then I wondered, what was anyone doing out there this late? The lake was empty when I arrived. No cars, no boats, no people, and it was almost 2 a.m. now. I hesitated. I didn't know if I should go out there. Something didn't feel right, but the cries were getting louder, more desperate. I couldn't just ignore them. So, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent. The cold hit me immediately, and the darkness felt thicker than before. I turned on the light and pointed it toward the lake. There, floating just off the shore, was a small boat, but I couldn't see anyone. The cries, though, they were coming from that direction. My first instinct was to call out, ask if they needed help, but I didn't. I couldn't explain why, but something stopped me. Instead, I just moved closer, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I got nearer to the water, the cries suddenly stopped. Silence. No splash, no voice. Just the sound of the water lapping against the boat. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty boat. My mind was racing. Where was the person? Why did the cries stop? I pointed the flashlight into the boat, but it was completely empty. No sign of anyone. That's when the realization hit me, hard and fast, like a punch in the gut. There was no one out there. The cries, they were meant to lure me out. My skin prickled as I realized how far from my tent I'd walked. The boat wasn't the danger. Whatever or whoever wanted me away from my tent was. I turned around, ready to head back. But just as I did, I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, coming from the direction of the trees toward me. I froze. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure whoever was behind me could hear it. I didn't dare turn around. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move. I took one step, then another, slowly. I didn't want to run, not yet. Maybe if I just walked away, whoever it was would leave me alone. But then the footsteps got faster, closer. I didn't think. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, the beam from my flashlight bouncing wildly, barely lighting the path. The footsteps behind me sped up, matching my pace, following me through the dark. I couldn't tell how close they were, but they felt too close. I could almost feel someone's breath on my neck. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My tent was in sight now, just a few feet ahead. I was so close. But then, I tripped. The flashlight flew out of my hand, landing somewhere in the bushes. Darkness swallowed me. The footsteps were almost on top of me now. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I reached for my pocket, where I always kept a small knife. I fumbled with it, my fingers numb from the cold and fear. Just as I pulled the knife out, I felt a hand grab my shoulder. The grip was strong, rough, and I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My mind went blank as everything around me seemed to stop. The silence returned, and with it, a crushing sense of dread. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see who or what had caught me. Then, everything went quiet. The footsteps stopped. The hand on my shoulder disappeared. I was left standing there, trembling, in the middle of the woods, alone. Or maybe not alone. I woke up to the sound of birds, and the first thing I noticed was that I couldn't move my hands. My wrists were tied, tight enough that I felt a dull pain when I tried to pull. For a moment, I thought maybe I was dreaming, but the rough fabric against my skin, the cold breeze creeping into the tent, all of it was too real. I blinked hard, trying to shake off the fog in my head, but no matter how much I tried to focus, I couldn't remember how I got here. My tent was dark, the only light coming through a small opening in the zipper. I twisted my wrists again, trying to free myself, but it only made the rope dig in deeper. Panic started rising in my chest, my heart pounding harder as my breaths became faster. What happened last night? I tried to think, but it was like my brain was full of holes. I could remember hiking, I could remember setting up camp, but after that, nothing. Just blank. And then I heard it, a sound outside the tent. Soft footsteps, slowly crunching over the fallen leaves. My blood froze. The sound was so faint, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but no. There it was again. Someone was coming closer. My heartbeat was so loud I was scared whoever was out there could hear it. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I thought about calling out, but my throat felt tight, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know who was outside. What if it was the person who tied me up? I listened, every sound around me making my skin crawl. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. Silence. Whoever it was, they weren't moving anymore. Were they waiting for me? Flashes of memory started to come back, but none of it made sense. I remembered meeting someone on the trail, a man. He seemed normal, just another hiker like me. We had talked briefly, shared a drink. That's where it all went blurry. I couldn't remember how the conversation ended or how I got back to my tent. Had I drunk too much? Had he? I shivered at the thought, feeling a sudden wave of nausea. What had I done? The footsteps started again, and this time they were right next to the tent. I had to move. I had to do something. My hands were still tied, but I kicked my legs, trying to shift my body into a better position, trying to hide myself in the shadows of the tent. I heard the zipper start to slide open, slowly, like whoever was outside was taking their time. I kicked harder, my wrists burning as I fought the ropes. They wouldn't budge. The tent opened enough for me to see a shadow, a figure standing in the gap, and I stopped moving, holding my breath. The person stepped inside. In the dim light, I recognized him. The man from the trail. He didn't seem surprised to see me tied up. He crouched down, his eyes calm, too calm. He smiled, as if this was all normal, and said, "You agreed to this, remember?" My mind spun. Agreed? To what? I tried to speak, to protest, but my mouth was dry, my tongue heavy. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, but his words only made me more confused. I only remembered agreeing to have a drink. We had been talking about our hiking routes, sharing tips. There was nothing else. Was there? "You said you wanted something different," he continued, his voice low and steady. His calmness made my stomach turn. "You said you trusted me." That's when the pieces started to fall into place. I had been friendly, too friendly. I had thought nothing of it, maybe even flirted a little. But that was normal, wasn't it? Just a harmless chat with a stranger. I hadn't agreed to this. I hadn't agreed to wake up tied in my own tent with no memory of how I got there. I started, but my voice was too weak. He moved closer, leaning in, his face inches from mine. "This is what you wanted. You said yes." My pulse raced. I knew I hadn't said yes. Or maybe I had said something, but not to this. Not to him tying me up. I tried to pull away, but he reached out and gently touched my face, his hand cold. I flinched, but I couldn't move far. He just kept smiling, as if he believed every word he was saying, as if this was some kind of game we had agreed on. But I knew this wasn't a game. The rope around my wrist suddenly felt looser. In the struggle, I had almost freed one hand. My heart pounded harder with the realization. I glanced at him, hoping he hadn't noticed. If I could just get one hand free, I could fight back, maybe even run. But before I could make a move, his hand grabbed my wrist, squeezing hard. "You can't leave," he whispered, his face so close now I could feel his breath on my skin. "Not yet. We're not done." The words sent a chill through me. My wrist was almost free, just a little more pulling. But before I could do anything, he leaned in closer, his lips brushing my ear as he said, "You'll understand soon." Panic surged through me, and with a sharp twist, I freed my hand. I swung at him, catching him off guard, but it wasn't enough. He grabbed me again, pinning me down with ease. I struggled, kicked, but he was too strong. The last thing I remember was his voice, calm and steady, saying, "You'll thank me later." And then, darkness. I woke up again, still tied, but now I was outside, the cold ground beneath me. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was nearby, waiting. We thought it would be a great idea. A weekend in the woods, away from the city, just the five of us, me, Jake, Sarah, Emily, and Dan. No phones, no stress, just nature. It sounded perfect. When Jake found this secluded campsite, far from any hiking trails, I didn't question it. I mean, I should have, right? But at the time, it felt like a cool adventure. We arrived on Friday afternoon. The road leading to the campsite was a dirt path that seemed to go on forever, winding deeper into the forest. By the time we parked the car, there was no signal, just trees everywhere. Sarah joked about how if a bear attacked us, no one would ever know. We all laughed, but there was something about the quiet. I didn't like it. It was too still, too far from everything. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the killjoy. Setting up camp took a while. The tents went up near a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. There was a lake a little further down, and Jake insisted we swim later. I wasn't sure if I wanted to, but everyone else seemed into it. We settled in quickly, laughing around a small fire, roasting marshmallows. It felt normal, like any camping trip should. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the forest seemed louder, closer. I kept feeling like someone, or something, was watching us. But I told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. The next morning, things got weird. Emily was the one who found it. She'd gone to collect some wood and came running back, holding something small and black. "Guys, look at this," she said, her voice shaky. It was a camera, a tiny hidden camera, like the ones used for spying. It had been tucked between some rocks near our tents. At first, we didn't know what to think. Dan joked that maybe some park rangers were spying on us, but we all knew this place wasn't patrolled. Who could have left it? Jake, being the tech guy, quickly grabbed his phone and hooked it up to see if we could access the footage. I remember feeling this sinking feeling in my stomach as we gathered around to watch. The first few clips were just of the campsite, shots of us arriving, setting up the tents, laughing. At first, we were confused. Why would someone be watching us? But then, the footage changed. There were clips of us sleeping. It was night, the campfire had gone out, and you could see us in our sleeping bags. And then, we saw him. A man. He was standing right there, just outside our tents, watching us. Not moving, not making a sound, just watching. I couldn't believe it at first. None of us could. Sarah gasped, and Jake cursed under his breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. We watched as this stranger circled our campsite, stopping now and then to just stare at each of us. How hadn't we noticed? How long had he been there? Panic set in. Jake rewound the footage, trying to see if there was anything we'd missed, but it was the same. Us, asleep, and this guy watching us. "We need to leave," I said, breaking the silence. The others agreed. We packed up in a rush, Everyone talking at once, trying to make sense of it. Who was this guy? Was he still here? Was he coming back? But things got worse. When we tried to start the car, it wouldn't turn on. Jake fiddled with the engine, but nothing. It was dead. I don't know if it was just bad luck or something else, but we were stuck. And that's when we saw him. He was standing in the tree line, just barely visible in the daylight. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But then Emily pointed, her voice barely a whisper. "Is that him?" It was the same figure from the camera, just standing there, half hidden behind a tree, watching. Jake yelled at him, but the man didn't move, just stood there. And then, slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the woods and disappeared. We were all frozen for a moment, not sure what to do. Should we chase him? Call for help? But there was no signal, no way to contact anyone. Nightfall was coming fast. The idea of staying another night, knowing that man could be out there watching, made my skin crawl. We barricaded ourselves in the tents, too scared to sleep, just waiting for something to happen. Every little sound made me jump, but the man never returned. Or if he did, we didn't see him. By morning, we were desperate. We left most of our stuff behind and decided to walk. There had to be a road somewhere, right? But as we packed up, Jake noticed the camera was gone. The same camera we'd found yesterday. It was missing. Someone had taken it. We hurried out of there, walking down the dirt road in silence, our minds racing. Who was that man? Why had he been watching us? And what would have happened if we hadn't found the camera? I keep thinking about the footage. There's one part that I can't get out of my head. Right at the end, before the video cuts off, you can see him one last time. He's looking right into the camera, smiling. Like he knows something we don't. We never found out who he was or why he was there. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder, is he still out there, watching someone else? I went to the woods to scatter my wife's ashes. It was her last wish, something she had told me during her final days. The place she had chosen was a quiet forest, a few hours away from our home. We used to go there, camp for a weekend, talk about everything and nothing. It felt right to bring her back there one last time. The trip itself was peaceful, almost too peaceful. When I arrived, I parked my car, grabbed my backpack, and started walking into the woods. The air was cold, and the trees made it feel like the world had closed in around me. I wanted to disconnect from everything, my life, my pain, so I turned off my phone. I told myself it was to focus on the moment, but really, I just didn't want any distractions. This was supposed to be about her. As I walked, memories of her kept coming back. I could almost hear her laugh, feel her hand in mine. It was too quiet, though. No birds, no wind, just me and the crunch of leaves under my boots. After a while, I found a spot near a small lake. We had camped there before. I could almost see us setting up the tent, arguing over who forgot the coffee. It felt like she was there with me. I scattered some of her ashes, said a few words, but I couldn't stay long. It was too much. I needed a break from the grief that had been crushing me for months. So I turned on my phone, hoping for some sort of distraction, maybe a news notification, or something to pull me out of the dark thoughts. Instead, I got a message from her. It just said, "Come to me." That was it, followed by some GPS coordinates. My heart stopped. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Her phone was back home. I had deactivated it after the funeral. There was no way this could be from her. I thought it must be a glitch, maybe an old message popping up for some reason, but the coordinates were new. It didn't make any sense. I checked again, even though I knew I wouldn't find anything. Her phone was off and I was here, in the middle of nowhere. I should have ignored it, but I couldn't. It felt personal, like something she would say. My chest tightened, and before I knew it, I started following the GPS. I wish I had stopped. I wish I hadn't let curiosity, or whatever it was, take over. But I kept walking. Each step took me deeper into the forest, into places I didn't recognize. The trees got denser, the path harder to follow. My phone buzzed again. Another message. "You're close." How could she know that? My mind was spinning, telling me it wasn't real. But my heart, it told me something else. Maybe I was looking for a sign, some connection. Maybe it was grief playing tricks on me. I followed the messages, each one guiding me further away from the lake, further from where I felt safe. My phone was starting to glitch, flickering every now and then. The battery was draining fast, too fast. But I couldn't stop. It felt like she was leading me somewhere, like there was something I needed to see. Then, another message. This one hit me hard. "You left me." It felt like a punch. I hadn't left her. She was gone. But still, the guilt washed over me. Was this some kind of sick joke? Who would do this? But then I thought, no one else knew I was here. "Come to me," the next message read. "You need to see where." Where? What did that mean? My head was spinning, and I started to doubt everything. The trees around me seemed to twist in the dark, and I wasn't sure if I was still in the real world or some nightmare I couldn't wake from. The messages, the memories, they all blended together, making me question what was real. Finally, the last message came. "I'm waiting." I found myself in a clearing I didn't recognize, though something about it felt familiar. My phone screen flickered one last time before it went black. Dead battery. That's when I realized how far I had wandered. I couldn't see the lake anymore, couldn't hear anything but my own breath and the pounding of my heart. The air was thick with silence, the kind that presses on you from all sides. I stood there, waiting for something, anything to happen, but there was nothing, no sign of her, just the cold, the dark, and the trees closing in. I don't remember much after that. I think I sat down, just staring at the ground, trying to make sense of what had happened. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that I heard voices, the sound of search and rescue. They found me sitting there, completely silent. I didn't have any answers for them. How could I explain? They didn't believe me about the messages. No one would. Her phone, they said, was still off, untouched, back home. There was no way it could have sent anything, but I know what I saw. I know what I followed. I left the forest, but I haven't found peace. There are still so many questions. Why did I follow those messages? Were they from her, or was something else leading me deeper into the woods? I guess I'll never know. All I know is that I left part of myself in that forest, just like I left her ashes. I've been hiking solo for years. I always preferred the quiet, just me, the trees, and no one else around. It's what I love the most, the sense of isolation, the escape from everything. That's why I headed deep into the mountains this time, further than I had ever gone. No signal, no trails, just wilderness. I thought I was prepared. I had done this so many times, nothing could go wrong. Or so I thought. The first few days were uneventful, almost peaceful. I set up camp near a small creek, and I spent my time walking through the thick trees, exploring. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I thought it was odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was normal this deep in the woods. Then, on the third day, I found the body. I was walking further from my campsite, trying to reach a higher point for a better view. I almost stepped on it. There, in the underbrush, was a body, what was left of it, at least. The stench hit me first, and I stopped breathing for a second, realizing what I had just found. The skin was pale, peeling away, and insects swarmed everywhere. It looked like it had been there for weeks. My stomach turned and I stumbled back. My first thought was to run, but something stopped me. I stared at it, trying to understand what I was looking at. Was it a hiker like me? How had they died? But more importantly, why hadn't anyone found them? This place was too remote. That's when it hit me. Whoever had left this body here might still be around, watching. My heart started pounding, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I needed to get back to camp, pack my things, and leave. Fast. When I got back to my camp, things were wrong. My gear, someone had been through it. My food was torn open and scattered, my water bottle slashed, and my backpack, where I had kept my compass and map, had been cut open. I dug through the mess, but they were gone. Someone had taken them. I looked around the clearing, my skin crawling. I wasn't alone out here. Whoever had done this knew I was here. Maybe they had followed me, waited for me to leave my camp, then gone through my stuff. And now they had made sure I couldn't leave. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just an animal, but that didn't make sense. An animal wouldn't have taken my compass. It wouldn't have cut open my backpack. Someone had done this. Night was falling fast. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait for whoever had sabotaged my gear to come back. I grabbed whatever was left of my things and started walking, trying to retrace my steps. I could barely see where I was going, but I had to keep moving. The deeper I walked into the forest, the darker it got, and soon I was surrounded by nothing but blackness. The woods felt different now. The silence that I once enjoyed felt suffocating. Every rustle, every crack of a twig made me jump. I turned around more than once, convinced someone was behind me, but there was never anyone there. Or maybe they were just good at hiding. As I walked, it became clear that I was lost. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't tell which way I had come from. My breathing became heavier, panic creeping in. Without a map or compass, I was going in circles, deeper into the woods. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves behind me. I froze, my heart beating in my ears. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, trying to reassure myself. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't an animal. It was them. I picked up my pace, walking faster, nearly tripping over roots in the dark. The crunching of leaves behind me continued, growing louder, closer. I broke into a run, my legs burning, lungs aching. Every step felt like I was sinking deeper into this nightmare. My mind raced, replaying the image of the body I had found. Was this how that person ended up like that? Alone, lost, hunted? I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into a small clearing. I stopped, gasping for air, looking around wildly. Then, in the distance, I saw it. Another campsite. Relief washed over me. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. Maybe there were others out here who could help me. I made my way toward the campsite, but as I got closer, something wasn't right. The tent was shredded, and there were dark stains on the ground. Blood. My heart sank. Whoever had been here had met the same fate as the body I had found. My legs felt weak, and I had to force myself to move, to keep going. I had no idea where I was heading, but staying in one place felt like a death sentence. I could still hear the sounds, footsteps, branches, snapping. They were getting closer again. I ran blindly through the woods. My body felt heavy, my legs barely able to carry me, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. I don't know how this ends. Maybe I'll find a way out, maybe not. But if you're reading this, it means I had enough time to share my story. And if you ever find yourself out here, in the middle of nowhere, alone, don't make the same mistake I did. because someone's always watching and they're waiting for you to make a wrong turn. My girlfriend and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We wanted to get away from the noise of the city, away from the endless messages, emails, and calls. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just us and nature. I remember how excited we were, packing up the car, double checking the gear, making sure we had everything. The drive was long, winding through dirt roads and dense trees until we finally reached the spot. No other cars, no signs of people, just perfect. We set up our tent, laughing and talking about how we'd finally have some peace. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was everything we had hoped for at first. The first strange thing we noticed was the child's shoe. It was lying in the dirt near the edge of the trees, half buried and wet with mud. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It didn't look old, but it didn't make sense either. We hadn't seen any kids or anyone out here. My girlfriend frowned, asking how long it had been there. I didn't know, but the sight of it unsettled me. The shoe was small, like it belonged to a toddler. It made me think about kids lost in the woods, accidents, things going wrong. We left the shoe where we found it, but it stayed on our minds. The mood shifted after that. We both felt it. It was like something was off, but we didn't say anything. I started gathering wood for the campfire, trying to shake the feeling, but every crack of a twig, every whisper of wind through the trees made me jump. As the sun began to dip, we decided to explore a little, hoping it would clear our heads. That's when we saw more signs, scraps of cloth snagged on branches, broken sticks that seemed too deliberate to be random. And then there were the footprints. They were faint, barely noticeable in the soft dirt, but they were there. And they didn't belong to animals. I tried to tell myself it could have been from a hiker, but deep down, I didn't believe it. It was getting dark by the time we found the old campsite. Hidden behind thick bushes, it looked like it hadn't been used in a while, but someone had definitely been there. There was a crumpled blanket, some empty food wrappers, and a notebook. My girlfriend opened the notebook, flipping through the pages. The writing was hard to read, messy, like the person who wrote it was in a hurry. But there were words that stood out: watching, waiting, and some other things I didn't want to think about. That's when we should have left. I wanted to pack up and go back to the car, but it was dark, and we were deep in the woods. Besides, what were we really afraid of? It's not like we'd seen anyone. We headed back to our camp, but something felt wrong. It was like the forest had changed. The trees looked closer together, the shadows longer. I tried to keep calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced behind us, I thought I saw movement, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Not ours. Someone was behind us. My girlfriend grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We started walking faster, trying to stay calm, but the footsteps kept following us, just out of sight. I don't know when it happened, but at some point we got lost. The path back to our tent was gone, and the woods seemed unfamiliar, like they had shifted while we weren't looking. Panic started to set in as we stumbled over roots and rocks, looking for any sign of the way back. That's when we found the first trap. It was crude, made of sticks and rope, hidden under a pile of leaves. My foot caught it, and the rope snapped, sending branches crashing down around us. It wasn't meant to kill, just to scare. And it worked. Someone was playing with us. They knew the woods better than we did, and they were toying with us like we were animals. We kept moving, but every path we tried was blocked by more traps, pits covered with branches, ropes stretched between trees to trip us. Whoever was out there, they wanted us to feel trapped, and we did. By now, it was pitch black. We had no idea where we were, and the footsteps were getting closer. I could hear breathing, low and steady, somewhere behind us. I told my girlfriend to keep going, to run, but there was no use. Every direction we took led to another dead end, another snare. We stopped, finally, too tired to keep going. The footsteps had stopped too. It was like they were waiting for us to give up. I collapsed against a tree, trying to catch my breath. My girlfriend was crying, saying we should have left when we found the shoe. I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually we heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate. Getting closer. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't work. All I could do was listen as the sound of our hunter's boots crunched through the leaves, getting closer and closer. The last thing I remember is the cold touch of metal against my skin and the sound of my girlfriend screaming. Then, nothing. No one will find us out here. Last year, I decided I needed a break from the city. Everything was too loud, too fast, and I felt like I was losing myself in all the noise. I thought a solo camping trip would help me clear my head. I had never camped alone before, but I convinced myself that it would be a good challenge. I wanted to prove that I could do it, that I didn't need anyone. I drove to a remote forest area, miles away from any town. The air was fresh, and the silence felt almost heavy after the constant buzz of the city. It was exactly what I needed. I parked my car at the entrance of the trail and hiked a couple of hours to find the perfect spot, right by a small stream surrounded by tall trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I liked it. Setting up my tent, I felt proud of myself. I spent the first evening by the fire, reading a book and listening to the sounds of the forest. It felt good to be alone. The fear that had been sitting in the back of my mind about being by myself in the wild slowly faded. I was in control. But things changed the next morning. When I stepped out of my tent, stretching and ready for another calm day, I saw something strange. A small note placed carefully on a rock near my tent. My first thought was confusion. I hadn't seen anyone the day before, and the nearest campsite was hours away. I picked up the note, and my stomach dropped. It said, "I see you." I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was a joke left by some previous camper, right? Still, I couldn't shake off the weird feeling in my chest, but I wasn't going to let that ruin my trip. I ignored it, pushed the note into my bag, and decided to move on with my day. The feeling of being watched, though, it wouldn't leave me. As I hiked around the area, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there, but no one was. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The next day, I found something even stranger. Hanging from a tree branch near my camp was a small doll, crudely made from twigs and cloth. That's when I really started to feel scared. This wasn't something a random camper would leave behind. It felt deliberate. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I had walked into someone's strange little game, but that didn't mean I was in danger. Still, I started keeping my knife closer, and at night, every noise made me jump. On the third day, I met someone. I was walking along a trail, trying to get my mind off things, when a man approached me. He was middle-aged, with a rough, unshaven face and a too friendly smile. He asked if I was camping alone, and I, stupidly, said yes. He gave me advice about the trails, asked a few more questions. Too many, really. Why I was out here, how long I planned to stay. He talked too much, and it made me uneasy. When he finally left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Could he be the one leaving the notes, moving things around my camp, or was I just being paranoid again? That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent felt louder than it should have been. I lay awake, clutching my knife, listening. Then, around midnight, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. circling my tent. My heart raced and I held my breath, too scared to move. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then slowly faded into the distance. In the morning, I found another note, this one pinned to a tree near my tent. Last night was too close. See you soon. That was it. I wasn't safe. I packed up my things as fast as I could and started down the trail back to my car. I didn't care about leaving things behind. I just needed to get out of there. The problem was, the trail felt longer. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't getting any closer to the parking lot. Panic set in. The quiet forest that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating, like it was closing in on me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and every crack of a branch made me jump. Then I tripped. I looked down and realized what I had fallen over. My own backpack, the one I had left at the campsite. How did it get here? My heart pounded in my ears. Someone had been here before me, someone had been following me, and they were always one step ahead. I got up trembling and kept running. The trees blurred around me, and I was no longer sure if I was even on the right path. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Then I heard it, a voice, quiet, almost a whisper. My name. I froze. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see who or what was behind me. But the voice came again, closer this time. My name spoken so softly it felt like it was coming from right beside me. I ran. I don't know how, but I made it back to my car. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and sped off. My heart didn't stop racing until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know who was out there or why they were following me. All I know is that I was lucky to get away. But sometimes, at night, I still hear that voice, whispers in the dark, calling my name. I should have known something felt wrong the moment we arrived at that campsite. It was me, Dave, Sarah, and Liz. Just 4 friends looking for a weekend getaway. We thought camping near an old abandoned prison would be fun. The prison had been shut down for years, and honestly, the whole thing felt like a joke. People in town told us creepy stories about the place, but we laughed it off. We were here to relax, maybe get spooked a little, but nothing serious. When we first set up the tents, the sky was already turning dark. The prison loomed not too far in the distance, its tall, crumbling walls barely visible through the trees. I couldn't stop looking at it. Something about it gave me a bad feeling, but I kept quiet. I didn't want to be the only one acting paranoid. We lit a fire, cooking dinner and joking around. Liz made fun of the prison, calling it the perfect horror movie location. We all laughed. But as the night grew colder, things started to change. The forest felt too quiet. No animals, no wind, just the sound of our fire crackling. And then we heard it. Footsteps. Faint, but definitely footsteps. They were slow, steady, moving just outside the light from the fire. I froze, listening closely, but Dave just waved it off. Probably just a deer, he said, shrugging, but it didn't sound like an animal to me. The footsteps were too even, like someone was pacing around. I looked at the others, waiting for them to say something, but no one seemed as bothered as I was. After a few more jokes and some nervous laughs, we decided to sleep. I tried to fall asleep, but the footsteps stuck in my head. They weren't normal, I knew that. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the dark roof of the tent. My heart wouldn't stop racing. Then, in the dead of night, the sound came back. This time, the steps were louder, circling us. They stopped, then started again, moving closer to our tents. I whispered, "Guys, do you hear that?" No one answered at first. But then Sarah spoke up, her voice shaky. "There's someone out there." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone, not something. The panic spread quickly after that. We huddled closer together in our sleeping bags, all pretending it would stop. But the footsteps didn't stop. Liz said she saw a shadow moving between the trees, just for a second. That's when we knew this wasn't in our heads. Someone was out there, walking around our camp, watching us. None of us slept that night. We stayed up, listening, waiting for whoever it was to come closer. But they never did. Eventually, the sounds faded, and the sky began to lighten with the morning. The next day, we found footprints, huge ones, bigger than any of ours, deep in the dirt just outside our tents. They led into the woods, disappearing among the trees. Dave tried to joke about it, saying maybe we had a friendly neighbor, but no one laughed. The fear in my stomach twisted harder when Sarah suggested we pack up and leave. I wanted to agree to run out of there as fast as possible, but Dave convinced us we were overreacting. He said it was probably some homeless guy wandering around, and leaving now would just ruin the trip. Against my better judgment, I stayed quiet. We all stayed. That night, the footsteps came back, louder, heavier, like whoever it was didn't care if we heard them now. The tension in our group was thick. We sat inside the tents, too scared to move, barely breathing. I could hear Liz's quick breathing next to me, and Sarah muttering under her breath, "What do we do? What do we do?" Then there was a noise, closer than before. A rustling sound right next to Liz's tent. I couldn't stop myself. I peeked out through the flap of my tent, just enough to see outside. There he was. A man stood a few feet away, staring into the forest. His back was to us, but I could see his filthy clothes, the way he held something in his hand, something long like a stick or a tool. He was just standing there, like he was thinking about what to do next. My heart pounded so hard I thought he'd hear it. I ducked back inside the tent, terrified to even breathe. I didn't say anything to the others. I couldn't. I just sat there, trembling, waiting for him to go away. Eventually he did. At dawn, we didn't waste any time. We packed up our stuff as fast as we could. No one talked. We just wanted to get out of there. But when we reached the cars, Dave wasn't with us. We called his name, looked around, but he was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no scream in the night, nothing. Just those same large footprints leading away into the woods. I remember Sarah breaking down, crying, saying this was all her fault for suggesting the trip. Liz tried to comfort her, but it didn't help. I wanted to go after Dave, to look for him, but at the same time, I knew we had to leave. I couldn't stay there any longer. In the end, we drove away, leaving him behind. We told the police what happened, but they never found him. They searched the area, checked the prison, but it was like Dave had just vanished. To this day, I don't know what happened to him, or who that man was. All I know is that I can still hear those footsteps in my nightmares, circling, coming closer, waiting. If you ever decide to camp near an abandoned place, don't. Just don't. We were all excited about the camping trip. It had been a long time since we'd done something like this. Away from the city, no phones, no work, just nature and us, 5 friends who had known each other for years. It was supposed to be a perfect getaway. The first night was great. We set up camp near a river, built a fire, and talked until late. The air was cool, but the fire kept us warm. Mark, John, Sarah, Lisa, and I sat around, sharing stories, laughing. I hadn't seen Mark in months. He had been working too much, and this trip was his idea to reconnect. He seemed happy, more relaxed than usual. But thinking back now, there were moments he looked distant, like his mind was somewhere else. I should have noticed it earlier. The next morning, I woke up to silence. At first, I thought everyone was still asleep, but when I stepped out of the tent, Sarah and Lisa were already up. John was sitting by the fire, poking at the dying embers. "Where's Mark?" I asked. John shrugged. "Probably went for a walk." But there was something off about his voice, like he wasn't convinced. We waited for a while, but when Mark didn't return, we started to worry. His sleeping bag was still in the tent, and his shoes were gone, so we figured he couldn't have gone too far. We spread out to look for him, calling his name, hoping he'd come running back with some stupid excuse about getting lost, but there was nothing. An hour later, we found his phone lying in the dirt, just outside the camp. It was strange because Mark never went anywhere without it. A few feet away, one of his shoes was lying near the riverbank. That's when the panic started to creep in. It didn't make sense. He wouldn't just leave his things scattered like that. We all stood there, staring at the shoe, wondering what had happened. The day dragged on, and the longer Mark was gone, the worse things got. We kept searching, but we found nothing except more strange signs. Deep scratches on a tree not far from the camp, like something, or someone, had clawed at it. Sarah started crying, saying we should call the police, but we were too deep in the woods, no cell signal, no way to reach anyone. John was quiet most of the day. He wasn't usually like that. He and Mark had been friends for the longest, and they'd spent most of the night talking by the fire. I asked him what they talked about, but he just shook his head, saying it was nothing important. By evening, the tension between us was unbearable. We gathered around the fire again, but nobody was talking. Everyone kept glancing at each other like we were waiting for someone to say something that made sense. That's when Sarah spoke up. "I saw John with Mark last night," she said, her voice trembling. "They were arguing about something." John looked up, surprised, but didn't say anything at first. The rest of us turned to him, waiting. He finally said, "We talked, but it was nothing, just about work. Mark was stressed, that's all." But the doubt had already set in. Why would John hide that they argued? And why did he seem so nervous all of a sudden? Lisa gave him a strange look, and I could feel the suspicion growing between all of us. The idea that maybe one of us knew more than we were saying was too real now. As it got darker, I found myself checking my tent, making sure it was zipped up tight, like that would protect me from whatever was happening. Then, right before dinner, Sarah found something that made everything worse. Mark's backpack, hidden under John's tent. She pulled it out, her face pale. "Why was this under your tent, John?" John looked shocked, but he quickly denied knowing anything about it. "I didn't put it there," he said. "I swear. I don't know how it got there." But no one believed him. How could we? Mark was missing, and now his stuff was hidden under John's tent. Sarah started yelling, accusing him of doing something to Mark, while Lisa stood there, silent, eyes wide. I didn't know what to think. It all seemed too much, but what other explanation was there? By the time night fell, none of us felt safe. I tried to sleep, but every sound outside the tent made me jump. The wind rustling the trees, the crackling of the fire. Everything felt like a threat. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was a scream. I bolted out of my tent, heart pounding, and ran toward the sound. The others were already there, standing in the dim light of the fire. John was crouched over something. No, someone. It was Mark. His body lay in the dirt, lifeless, his shirt soaked in blood. John was holding a knife. "It's not what it looks like," John shouted, his voice desperate. "I didn't," but none of us listened. Sarah screamed again, and Lisa backed away, shaking her head, whispering, "Oh my God, oh my God." I didn't move. I couldn't. Everything around me felt unreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Mark was dead, and John was standing there with the knife. I don't know what happened after that. It's all a blur. But as we stood there, staring at Mark's body, I realized something that still haunts me. The danger had now. I never thought I'd share this story, but after hearing other people talk about strange things happening in remote camping areas, I can't get it out of my head. Maybe someone out there can explain it, though I'm not sure if I want to know the truth. It happened last year. I've always enjoyed solo camping. There's something about the quiet that makes me feel at peace, like I'm far away from everything that usually stresses me out. I'd camped in a lot of places, mostly remote areas where you don't see other people for miles. This trip wasn't supposed to be different. Just a few days in the woods, sleeping under the stars, with no one around to bother me. That night, I set up my tent in a small clearing. It was a perfect spot, flat ground, trees surrounding me, but not too close, and no sign of other campers. The air was cool, and everything seemed normal. I made a fire, ate my dinner, and then crawled into my tent. The forest around me was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant sounds of animals moving through the brush. It was peaceful. I quickly fell asleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. Something wasn't right. I felt cold air on my face. At first, I thought the wind had picked up, but then I realized my tent had been slashed open. The flap wasn't unzipped, it was cut, a long, jagged tear running down one side. I blinked a few times, trying to make sense of it. My brain wasn't fully awake yet. I sat up, my heart starting to pound as I noticed my stuff was scattered outside the tent, like someone had been going through it. That's when I felt it, the fear, deep in my gut. My first thought was that an animal had done this, maybe a bear, but I hadn't heard anything. It didn't make sense. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking, and quickly scanned the area outside the tent. There was nothing, no animal, no person. Just my clothes, my food, my gear, all tossed around the campsite. I sat there for a second, my mind racing. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps, no voices. I told myself it must have been the wind, or maybe I didn't secure the tent properly before falling asleep. But the cut, it was too clean, too deliberate. And then I heard it. A whisper, quiet, like someone trying not to wake me up. It came from the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. My name, soft, almost like it was floating on the wind. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone for days, and now someone was out there in the dark, whispering my name. Panic hit me hard. I shined the flashlight toward the trees, trying to see who was out there. The beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything, just trees and shadows. The whispering continued, growing closer, repeating my name over and over. It was quiet, but unmistakable. I didn't recognize the voice, but something about it felt familiar, like it knew me. I yelled out, demanding to know who was there, but the whispering didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to get louder, more insistent. My heart was racing, my mouth dry. I started to wonder if I was going crazy. Was I hearing things? Was I dreaming? I grabbed my knife, more for comfort than anything else, and kept the flashlight pointed toward the sound. The whispering wasn't stopping, and I felt like it was closing in on me even though I still couldn't see anyone. Every time I pointed the light at a new spot, the sound seemed to move, staying just out of reach. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. Complete silence. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. My eyes darted around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible at the edge of the clearing, standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was too dark to make out any details, but I knew it was a person. They stood there, motionless, watching me. I called out again, but they didn't respond. They just stood there, like they were waiting for something. I took a step forward, and in that moment, the figure disappeared, just melted back into the darkness without a sound. I stood there, not sure if I had actually seen someone or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The silence was unbearable. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my whole body tense, waiting for whatever would come next. But nothing did. The figure was gone, and the whispering didn't start again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there, knife in hand, flashlight pointed at the trees, waiting. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up everything as fast as I could and left. I didn't care about the mess. I just needed to get out of there. As I walked away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I told a few people about it later, they shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a trick of the mind, maybe even a prank from some other campers. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw, even if no one believes me. Here's the thing, though. After that night, I did some research about that area. I found out that other campers have reported similar stories: whispering voices, strange figures in the trees, / tents. No one's ever been hurt, but the stories are all the same. And they all end the same way, with the whispering stopping just when you think it's over. But the truth is, I still hear it sometimes. Even now, months later, when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I swear I can hear someone whispering my name from the dark corners of the room. We thought it was just going to be a simple camping trip. It was supposed to be part of our research project, 5 of us, all college students, studying forest ecosystems. We picked this remote campsite deep in the woods, far away from anyone. At first, everything seemed fine. We set up our tents, collected firewood, and started our research. The air was fresh, the trees thick and towering. But I don't know why. Even on the first night, I couldn't shake this feeling in my gut. Something was wrong. I told myself it was just nerves. I wasn't used to being out in the wild for more than a day or two. But it wasn't just that. It felt like something was watching us. I even mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed. Maybe I was imagining things, I thought. The second day, we found something weird. We were hiking deeper into the woods, collecting samples, when we came across another campsite. It was abandoned, like someone had left in a hurry. There were some old cooking pots, a broken tent, and scattered belongings. We found an old diary half buried in the dirt. Sam, one of the guys in our group, picked it up. It was worn and dirty, but still readable. We thought it was interesting, maybe even helpful for our project, so we brought it back to our campsite. Later that night, we started reading it around the campfire. The entries were from someone who had camped in the same spot years ago. At first, it seemed normal. The writer talked about their hikes, the wildlife, and the peacefulness of the woods. But then, the tone changed. The writer mentioned hearing strange noises at night, branches breaking, and rustling leaves when there was no wind. They wrote about feeling like they were being watched, but no one was ever there when they looked. We laughed it off at first, saying the writer probably got scared by some animals. But as we read further, the entries got more unsettling. The camper wrote about waking up to find their belongings moved, food missing from their pack. And each night, the sounds got closer. Footsteps around their tent, low whispers they couldn't quite make out. The last few entries were frantic, like they were losing their mind. The final words were barely legible. "They're coming for me. I can feel it. I won't make it out." After reading that, the mood shifted. No one was laughing anymore. I could tell the others were uncomfortable, even if they didn't want to admit it. The fire crackled, but the air felt colder. Sam said we should stop reading, that it was just some scared camper who probably wandered off or got lost. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if something had really happened to them? What if they never left these woods? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every crack of a branch outside the tent made my heart race. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but my mind kept going back to the diary. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. slow, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath. They circled our camp, then stopped right outside my tent. I waited, terrified, but eventually, they moved away. The next morning, I asked if anyone else had heard it. Sam just brushed it off, saying it was probably a deer or something, but I could see the worry in his eyes. The next few days got worse. We started hearing more strange sounds, finding our gear moved when we woke up. I noticed my flashlight was missing one morning, and others started losing small things too, water bottles, knives. It felt like we were being messed with. I could see it in the others. They were scared, but no one wanted to admit it. We all tried to keep calm, but the tension was building. One night, things got really bad. It was late, and we were all around the fire. Sarah, another girl in our group, was arguing with Sam. I don't even remember what it was about, but everyone was on edge. I snapped at Sam too, and he stormed off into the woods. I didn't try to stop him. I thought he just needed to cool off. But Sam never came back. We spent hours looking for him, calling his name, but it was like he had vanished. The forest was thick and dark, and there was no sign of him anywhere. The fear hit us hard then. We all knew something was wrong, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. The diary was in the back of my mind the whole time. What if the same thing was happening to us? The next day, we were too scared to stay, but leaving the camp didn't feel right either. We thought maybe Sam would come back, but deep down, I knew he wouldn't. We packed up our stuff anyway, ready to leave as soon as we could, but when we tried to hike out, it felt like the forest was keeping us there. We couldn't find the trail we had come in on. The trees all looked the same, twisting and closing in around us. Every direction felt wrong. Now, it's just me. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. The others are gone. One by one, they disappeared. Sarah, Mark, everyone. I didn't see them go, but they're gone. I hear the footsteps every night, closer and closer. I know they're coming for me. I found the diary again, buried in the dirt where we left it. It's open to that last entry. The words are faded, but I know what they say. They're coming for me. I won't make it out. I don't think I will either. I needed a break from the city. Work was too much, and I was tired of the noise, the people, and everything around me. So I decided to go camping alone, just me and nature. I found a spot in a remote forest, far from any trail. Any trails or other campers. It was quiet. That's what I wanted. No distractions, no stress. The first day was perfect. I set up my tent in a small clearing, away from everything. I could only hear the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful. I felt safe, like the world had stopped for a while, and it was just me out there. I thought I needed this, to reconnect with nature, to be alone with my thoughts. That night, I heard some noises. They didn't really bother me at first. It was probably just animals moving around. It's the forest, after all. I didn't think much about it, and I fell asleep pretty quickly. The next morning, everything changed. When I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, I noticed something strange. There were metal animal traps everywhere. Big, sharp traps scattered around my campsite, like someone had carefully placed them there while I slept. My heart started to race. I knew they hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I stood there for a while trying to understand what I was looking at. Who would do something like this? And more importantly, why? I started to remember the noises I heard last night. I thought they were just animals, but now it felt different. It felt like someone was watching me. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being trapped. The idea that someone had come close enough to my tent without me knowing made me feel uneasy. Panic was rising in my chest. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course. I wanted to leave right away, but the traps made it difficult. There was no way I could pack everything and get out without risking stepping into one. They were everywhere, and I didn't want to accidentally trigger one. So I told myself I would wait. I'd leave in the morning, at first light. As the day went on, I started hearing the noises again. They were distant at first, like something moving through the woods. Then they got closer. Footsteps, twigs snapping, rustling. Every few hours, the sound would come back, always a little closer than before. I couldn't see anything, though. Whatever, or whoever it was, it stayed hidden. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was still animals. Maybe I was overthinking things. But no matter what I told myself, I couldn't ignore the fear growing inside me. I wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was out there, playing games with me. As the sun started to set, I became more desperate. I needed to get out, but I was scared of moving. I didn't want to get caught in one of those traps. The noises outside didn't stop. Every time I heard a twig snap, I froze, listening, waiting for something to happen. But it never did. It was just noise, just the feeling that someone was watching. I started questioning my own mind. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the traps were already here, and I just didn't notice them. Maybe I put them there myself. But no, that couldn't be right. I wasn't crazy. Someone else was out here. I was sure of it. The noises got louder as night came. My flashlight was my only comfort, but even that didn't last. It died after a few hours. Now I was in complete darkness. Just me, the sound of the wind, and those footsteps getting closer and closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I found a stick, sharp enough to use as a weapon, though I didn't know what good it would do. I sat in my tent, listening to the sounds around me, trying to stay calm, trying to convince myself I was going to be okay. But then I heard it. Footsteps, right outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was circling my camp. I held my breath, too scared to move. My mind raced with thoughts of what could happen. I knew I was trapped, just like those poor animals these traps were meant for. I felt like prey, waiting for the hunter to strike. But then, nothing happened. I must have passed out from exhaustion at some point, because I woke up the next morning, still inside my tent, still alive. For a second, I thought maybe it had all been a bad dream, but when I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. The traps, they were gone. Every single one of them, gone, like they had never been there. I didn't waste time. I packed up as fast as I could and started walking back to my car, looking over my shoulder every few minutes. There was no one. It was like whatever had been out there had disappeared along with the traps. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me the whole time. As I drove away from the campsite, I kept thinking about the traps. Who would go through all that trouble? Was it just a cruel joke? Or was it something more? I'll never know. But then, just as I was about to leave the forest behind, I saw it. A single metal trap lying in the middle of the road, right where I had to drive over it. Someone had put it there. Someone wanted me to know they were still watching. I swerved around it and kept driving, my heart pounding the whole way home. I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. I've always liked being alone. There's something about the quiet, the way the world seems to slow down when there's no one else around. That's why I decided to go camping alone on a small, remote island. It was only accessible by boat, far from people, far from noise, exactly what I wanted. I borrowed a small rowboat from a friend, packed some supplies, and rowed to the island. It took longer than I thought to get there, but the journey felt peaceful. The water was calm, and I could feel the stress from the city melting away with each stroke of the oars. When I arrived, the island was as quiet as I hoped. No phone signal, no signs of life. Just trees, the soft lapping of water against the shore, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. After setting up my tent, I sat outside, watching the sun go down. I thought about how perfect this place was, how I could stay here forever, alone. I wasn't scared. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness. I'd camped plenty of times before, but something about being on this island felt different, more isolated than I expected. But I shrugged it off, thinking that's exactly why I came here in the first place, to be alone with my thoughts, with no distractions. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. The sounds of the forest seemed louder than usual. Crickets, branches snapping in the wind. Normal, I told myself. Just nature. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of my sleep. I lay there in my tent, listening, and that's when I heard it, a faint sound, like someone rowing a boat, the soft, rhythmic splash of oars hitting water. I sat up, confused. No one else was supposed to be here. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining it toward the lake. There was nothing there. No boat, no movement, just the still, black water reflecting the moonlight. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to see if the sound would come back. But it didn't. Maybe it was the wind, I thought, or waves hitting the rocks. I tried to convince myself it was nothing and went back inside the tent. I fell asleep, but the sound stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night, I was on edge before the sun even went down. I tried to distract myself, telling myself I was overreacting. But as soon as it got dark, I couldn't relax. My eyes kept drifting toward the water, waiting for something to happen. And sure enough, late into the night, I heard it again. Rowing. Closer this time. My heart raced, pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining it toward the water. But like before, there was nothing. Just the same empty lake, calm and still. I stayed outside longer this time, walking to the edge of the water, listening. The sound had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stared at the dark water, half expecting to see a boat appear out of nowhere, but it didn't. The night was silent again. I spent the next day feeling anxious, jumping at every little sound. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. By the time night came, I was exhausted but too scared to sleep. I lay in my tent, waiting, listening. When the rowing sound came back, it was louder than ever, clear, deliberate. Like someone was right there, coming toward me. I froze, too scared to move, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, but it was so close now, too close to ignore. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight, and ran to the water's edge. I shined the light across the lake, my hands shaking. Nothing. No boat, no person, just the same dark water, smooth as glass. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the water until the sun came up, too afraid to leave, too afraid to stay. I wanted to leave the island, but it was still too early, and I didn't have the strength to row back yet. I felt trapped. Every noise, every sound made me jump. By the fourth night, I was completely paranoid. I hadn't eaten much, hadn't slept, and I was sure I was losing my mind. The sound of rowing came again, right on time, but this time I didn't move. I just sat there in my tent, frozen, listening as it got closer and closer. I knew I couldn't handle it anymore. I had to leave. At dawn, I packed up my things in a panic, barely taking the time to think. I rowed as fast as I could back toward the mainland, my arms burning with effort. The island disappeared behind me, but the unease didn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. Then, halfway across the lake, I heard it. A splash, soft but unmistakable. I stopped rowing and turned around. There was nothing, just the same quiet water stretching out in all directions. But I heard it again, the faint rhythmic sound of oars coming from behind me. The same sound I had heard every night on that island. Only this time, I was in the middle of the lake. I rowed harder, not looking back again. Even when I reached the shore, even when I was safely back on land, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, following me, watching me. And I still don't know if I imagined it or if someone, somehow, was really out there with me, rowing just out of sight. I haven't gone back to that island. I don't think I ever will. I'm not really sure why I'm posting this, but I guess I just need to share what happened. I can't sleep anymore, and it's been hard to think straight since it happened. Maybe someone out there has gone through the same thing. Maybe it'll help if someone reads this. My girlfriend and I thought it would be a good idea to go camping by the river, away from the noise of the city. We both needed a break. The plan was simple: spend a quiet weekend, just the two of us, surrounded by nature. We found this secluded spot online. It was a bit out of the way, but that was the whole point. A place where we could finally relax. The first few hours were great. We set up our tent, made a small fire, and listened to the sound of the river nearby. The air was fresh, and there were birds singing in the trees. I remember thinking that we'd finally gotten away from everything. But as the day started to end, I noticed something strange about the woods. The trees felt closer, somehow. The sky darkened faster than it should, and the calm feeling I had earlier started to fade. After dinner, we decided to take a walk around. It was then that we found them. Hanging from the trees around our campsite were these little dolls, crudely made from twigs and pieces of cloth. At first, I thought they were just some kind of joke, like maybe some kids had left them there, but as I looked closer, they didn't feel like a joke. They were strange, with bits of animal fur tangled in them. They hung silently, swaying a little in the evening breeze, and I couldn't help but feel like someone had put them there on purpose. It made my skin crawl. I told my girlfriend we should head back to the tent. She laughed it off at first, saying it was probably some old superstition, but I could see she was a little uneasy too. As we walked back, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I don't know why. I just had this feeling that we weren't alone anymore. Back at the campsite, we tried to settle down for the night, but neither of us could sleep. The forest, which had been so peaceful before, now felt oppressive. Every small noise, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, made us jump. I tried to brush it off as just nerves, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent at one point, but when I looked, there was nothing. "We'll leave in the morning," I told her, first thing. But when the morning came, our situation got worse. A lot worse. We went to pack up the car, but it wouldn't start. I checked the tires. They'd been slashed. The engine wires? Ripped out. Someone had done this while we were sleeping. Panic hit me like a punch to the gut. We were stranded. There was no cell service either. We tried to stay calm, but deep down, I think we both knew we were in trouble. I told her we should start walking, try to find the road. We grabbed what we could carry and headed out, hoping to get a signal somewhere along the way. But the further we walked, the more lost we became. The woods started to look the same in every direction, like the trees were shifting around us. And the dolls, they kept appearing. At first, we thought we were seeing things, but then we'd come across another one, hanging from a branch, staring down at us. How could they be everywhere? It felt like someone was following us, moving them. I don't know how long we walked, but by afternoon we were both exhausted, scared, and completely lost. That's when we heard it. Footsteps behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing, just the wind and the trees. But the footsteps didn't stop. They followed us, steady and slow. I felt like we were being hunted. We stumbled upon a small cabin deep in the woods, the kind you see in old horror movies. I didn't want to go inside, but we didn't have a choice. We needed shelter. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, and inside was even worse. Old camping gear, blankets, cans of food, stuff left behind by other people. But the thing that froze my blood was that some of the gear looked familiar. A backpack just like the one we had back at the tent. I tried to tell myself it wasn't ours, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Someone had been here before us, and they hadn't left. As night fell again, we barricaded ourselves inside the cabin, trying to keep the door shut with whatever we could find. My girlfriend was shaking, and I couldn't blame her. I was too. Outside, I could hear the footsteps again, closer this time. Whoever or whatever was out there, they knew we were inside. We sat in the dark for hours, holding our breath at every sound. The footsteps stopped eventually, but the silence was worse. It stretched on forever, the kind of quiet that presses down on you, makes it hard to think. Just before dawn, I heard the door creak. Slow, deliberate. Something was out there, pushing it open. I didn't have the courage to move, to check if it was real or just my imagination. I felt my girlfriend grab my arm, her grip tight and terrified. We waited, not daring to breathe, and then the door swung open fully. I'm not usually someone who believes in signs or warnings, but after what happened on that camping trip, I'm not sure what I believe anymore. We were 5 friends, eager to get away from everything. Life was stressful, and a weekend in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. The campsite was remote, just how we liked it. No phone signal, no other campers, only trees and quiet. At first, it was nice. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and telling jokes. But even though I was surrounded by my friends, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. I kept brushing it off, telling myself I was just tired from the drive, but something about the place felt wrong, like we weren't alone. The next morning, while exploring the area, we found it. A small, old weathered journal buried under a pile of rocks near a fallen tree. It was leather-bound and covered in dirt. Naturally, we were curious. Who wouldn't be? Emily was the first to suggest reading it. We all sat around the fire while Jake started flipping through the pages. At first it was innocent. The person who wrote it was like us, someone who came to camp, hike, and escape the noise of the city. But after a few pages, the entries got darker. The camper began talking about hearing strange noises at night, like footsteps outside the tent. They wrote about seeing shadows moving between the trees, even though no one else was supposed to be out there. We laughed it off at first, thinking it was just a prank or a made-up story to freak people out. Jake made a joke, something like, "Guess we're not the only ones with wild imaginations." But I didn't laugh. The things the writer described, it felt familiar. I remembered hearing something rustling in the bushes the night before, but I didn't say anything. It felt stupid, like I was being paranoid. Now, I wasn't so sure. The day passed, but the mood was different. We were quieter. Every time a branch snapped or the wind blew, I saw one of us glance nervously at the trees. I thought it was all in my head, but then it started happening again. At first, it was just small things. The feeling of being watched, hearing twigs breaking when no one was moving. Jake swore he saw a shadow, just for a second, darting behind a tree. He laughed it off, but I could see in his face that he was nervous. We all were. That evening, we decided to read more of the journal. Maybe it would distract us, or maybe we were hoping the rest of the entries would be less creepy. But they weren't. They were worse. The camper talked about waking up to find their tent unzipped, even though they were sure they closed it. Their food was missing, and they started seeing more shadows. They wrote that they could feel someone or something watching them, following them. Every time they tried to leave, they felt like they were being pulled back. I couldn't take it anymore. I told the group we needed to leave. I didn't care if it sounded crazy. I just had this overwhelming feeling that if we stayed, something bad would happen. Jake and Emily argued, saying it was all just coincidence, that we were letting the journal get to us. But Alex, my closest friend, was on my side. He said he had felt the same thing, like we weren't alone out here. Then Marcus went missing. He had wandered off, said he needed some space, but it had been too long. We called his name, searched around the camp, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in. We were getting ready to go find him when he finally stumbled back into the clearing. He looked pale, shaken. He said he'd gotten lost, that he'd been walking in circles even though he was sure he hadn't gone far. That night, no one slept. We all stayed by the fire, taking turns reading the last entries of the journal. The camper wrote that they couldn't tell what was real anymore. They saw people, figures, standing just beyond the trees, but when they ran towards them, they vanished. They tried to leave but kept ending up back at the same spot. The last entry was barely readable. It was just a mess of scribbles and frantic words like trapped and watched. There was no mention of the camper ever leaving. By morning, we were done. We packed up as fast as we could, but it felt like the woods didn't want to let us go. Every noise seemed louder, every shadow more threatening. As we hurried to get everything together, I swore I saw something. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It was just standing there, watching us. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat was dry, my heart pounding. We started walking back towards the car, but the feeling never went away. It was like we were being followed, the sound of footsteps just behind us, always just out of sight. Even when we finally got to the car, even when we were speeding away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had come with us. I still can't. That was a year ago. I haven't spoken to most of the group since. We just drifted apart after that. I don't know if they feel the same way, if they see the same things I do. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I feel it. That same presence. Watching. Waiting. I never should have read that journal. I still can't get the sound out of my head. The wind through the trees, the crackle of our campfire, and his laugh. Everything seemed perfect that night. Jake and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a break from everything, just the two of us, no distractions, no one else around. The campsite was quiet, almost too quiet. We were deep in the woods, far from the main trails. No other campers. I liked that at first. We laughed, made s'mores, and talked until the fire died down. I remember how happy I felt. It was just us. I woke up the next morning, cold. The sun had barely come up, but I noticed something immediately. Jake wasn't in the tent. I wasn't worried at first. He was always an early riser. Maybe he had gone to gather some wood or take a short walk. I crawled out of the tent, calling his name. There was no answer, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I walked around the campsite looking for him. His shoes were still there, next to the fire pit. That's when I started feeling uneasy. Why would he leave without his shoes? I called his name again, louder this time, but the woods swallowed my voice. My heart began to race as I scanned the area, hoping to see him coming back. I don't know why I went toward the edge of the camp. Something drew me there. The trees were thicker, casting long shadows even though it was morning. That's when I saw it. A broken branch, snapped in half, and the ground beneath it was disturbed. The dirt had been kicked up, like there had been a struggle. My stomach dropped. There was a small, dark stain on one of the rocks nearby. I touched it, and it smeared red on my fingers. Blood. My mind raced. What happened here? Jake wouldn't just disappear like this. Panic rose in my chest, and my breathing got heavier. I followed the trail of broken twigs and scuffed dirt deeper into the forest. Every step made me more afraid, but I couldn't stop. I had to find him. After what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled on something I hadn't noticed before, a campsite hidden in a small clearing. It wasn't far from ours, but it looked abandoned. The tents were dirty, old. The air felt wrong here, like something had been waiting. I didn't see it the day before. How could we have missed it? I didn't want to get closer, but I had to. Trash was scattered around, empty cans, torn clothes, wrappers. It looked like someone had been living here, but not recently. Then I saw something that made my skin crawl, a bloodied knife half buried in the dirt. My hand shook as I picked it up, and right next to it, tangled in some bushes, was a piece of torn fabric. It was part of Jake's shirt. My heart was pounding in my ears. This wasn't an accident. Something bad had happened to him. I could barely think straight, my mind jumping between possibilities. Maybe someone had attacked him, dragged him away, or worse. I wanted to scream, but I didn't want to draw attention. What if whoever did this was still around? I ran back to our camp, trying to keep my steps quiet but fast. I needed to get help, but our phones were dead. No signal out here. We thought being disconnected would be fun, but now it felt like a death sentence. I grabbed a flashlight and a small knife, just in case, and started heading back towards the main road. But the woods didn't feel the same. Every sound made me jump. Twigs snapping, birds rustling in the trees. I kept thinking someone was watching me, tracking my every move. I could hear my own breath, shallow and fast, as I hurried along the barely visible path. But it wasn't enough. No matter how fast I walked, it felt like something, or someone, was always just a few steps behind me. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone there. But there was no one. My legs were shaking, and I almost tripped over a root, but I kept going. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something, like the trees were closing in. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear was real. I needed to get out. Just when I thought I was almost safe, I heard a twig snap behind me, louder than before. I froze. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. Slowly, I turned, gripping the small knife in my hand, ready for whoever or whatever was there. But there was nothing, just trees, just the wind. I turned back and started walking again, faster this time, my heart in my throat. That's when I saw it. Movement, just up ahead between the trees. At first, I thought it was Jake. Maybe he was hurt, maybe he was coming back. I called out his name, but there was no answer. The figure stopped moving, standing still like it was watching me. I took a step back, my legs trembling. It wasn't him. I knew that now. Whoever it was, they didn't move right. They were too still, too quiet. My throat tightened, and I turned to run, but I heard it again. Footsteps, faster this time, behind me. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, the knife still in my hand, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. I don't remember how long I ran. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. I didn't stop until I reached the road, collapsing on the pavement, exhausted and terrified. I don't know who or what was out there. I never found Jake. They never did either. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear him. His voice, his laugh, coming from the woods. And I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting. Or if something else is. I always liked camping alone. There's something about the quiet that makes everything feel clearer. No people, no noise, just me and the trees. That's why I went deep into the woods this time, further than usual. I wanted total isolation, to disconnect. I didn't expect to meet anyone, especially not at the campsite I picked. But of course, nothing ever goes as planned. I had set up my tent, made a small fire, and was enjoying the peaceful evening when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were too steady, too human. I froze for a second, not sure whether to hide or confront whatever or whoever was coming. Then, a man stepped out from the trees. He looked ordinary enough, maybe in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and a heavy backpack. He smiled, but something about it didn't seem right. Too forced, maybe. He said he was passing through and asked if he could share the campsite for the night. He claimed it wasn't safe to camp alone out here, especially after dark. It was odd. People don't usually just appear like that in the middle of nowhere. But I didn't want to be rude, and besides, he seemed harmless enough. So I said, sure, why not? We sat by the fire, and after a while, he started talking. He mentioned he'd been coming to this area for years, knew every trail, every hidden spot. Then, the conversation turned darker. He started telling me about the accidents that had happened nearby. Hikers disappearing, hunters being found dead, and campers who were never seen again. At first, I thought he was just trying to scare me. People like to tell ghost stories around campfires, right? But as he kept going, his tone changed. He wasn't telling these stories like they were just tales. He talked about each one with a kind of strange familiarity, like he knew the victims, like he was there when it happened. I laughed nervously, trying to shake it off. I figured maybe he was just messing with me, trying to freak me out for fun. But there was something in his eyes, something unsettling that made me feel like he wasn't joking. The stories got more detailed. He talked about a group of friends who camped in this exact spot a few years ago. One of them went off to gather firewood and never came back. A search party found his body days later, torn apart like by an animal. But no one ever saw any signs of one. Then there was the couple who went missing, also not far from here. Their car was found, doors open, keys still in the ignition, but they were never found. It's like they just vanished. He described how they must have wandered too far from their tent, into the wrong part of the forest. The way he told these stories, it was like he wasn't just repeating what he heard. It felt like he was remembering something he'd seen or done. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. Why did he know so much? How did he know so many details that weren't in the news? And why was he telling me all this? My hands started to sweat and I felt trapped. The fire crackled between us, but I felt cold. I glanced at my backpack, wondering if I could pack up and leave without making it obvious. But when I looked up, he was watching me closely. His smile had faded, replaced with something colder. He said it was better to stay put, especially with all the accidents around here. His words hung in the air like a threat. Suddenly, everything felt wrong. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, but the way he talked, the way he looked at me, it felt like he was playing with me, like he was enjoying watching me squirm. I stood up, muttering something about needing to take a piss, but he didn't move, just sat there, watching. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a step back, then another, toward the trees. He didn't say anything, just kept staring, like he knew I was thinking of running. I turned and walked away, not far, just enough to get out of his sight. My legs shook as I moved behind a tree, trying to steady my breath. I had to leave. I couldn't spend the night there, not with him. But the thought of walking through the woods with him possibly following terrified me. Then I heard him call out, "You won't make it far, you know." My blood went cold. I wasn't sure if I imagined it or if he was really taunting me. I peeked around the tree and he was still sitting by the fire, but his head was turned slightly, listening, waiting. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my stuff and stuffed it into my bag as quietly as I could. My heart raced as I tried not to make noise. I glanced at him again, but he hadn't moved. Taking a deep breath, I started walking, slowly at first, then faster. The further I got from the fire, the darker it became, and soon I could barely see. My only guide was the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. There was no way he'd follow me. Then I heard a branch snap behind me. I stopped, frozen. Was it him or just an animal? I didn't dare look back, didn't want to know. I forced myself to keep walking, even though my legs felt like they would give out at any second. Another snap, closer this time. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short gasps. The trees blurred as I pushed myself forward, not caring where I was going, just away from him. But as I ran, I heard his voice again, calm, almost casual, echoing through the trees. No one ever gets out alive. And that's when I knew I wasn't imagining it. He was coming after me. My boyfriend Tom and I had planned this camping trip for weeks. We needed a break, a few days away from the city noise. We drove for hours, deeper and deeper into the forest. When we finally found the remote campsite, it was perfect, completely isolated, just like we wanted. The trees surrounded us in all directions, and you couldn't hear anything but the wind. At first, it felt peaceful, like we were truly alone in nature. But after we set up our tent, I noticed something strange. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no animals, nothing. I told Tom, and he just laughed, said it was normal this far out. I wasn't sure, but I tried to push the thought away. Maybe I was just too used to the city sounds. Night fell, and the forest finally came alive with noises. We sat by the fire, the crackling flames the only light in the darkness. The trees creaked, and I could hear rustling in the bushes. Every small sound made me jump. Tom teased me for being paranoid, but I swear I kept seeing shadows just outside the fire's light. He convinced me it was just animals. The next morning, we were packing up for a short hike when Tom noticed something. A small black object hidden in the brush. He bent down and pulled out a camera. It was pointed directly at our tent. My heart sank. Who would be filming us? I felt exposed, like someone had been watching us all night. Tom tried to calm me down, saying maybe it was some park surveillance, but the idea of someone spying on us made me feel sick. We searched the area and found 2 more cameras, both hidden carefully, both aimed at our camp. We didn't know what to do. Should we leave? We hadn't seen anyone nearby, so we convinced ourselves it was just some weird security setup, but it didn't feel right. We kept looking around, and that's when we found it. A small laptop hidden in the bushes, connected to the cameras. I was scared, but Tom was curious. He opened the laptop, and there were videos of us. Hours of footage from the night before. Every move we made, recorded. My blood ran cold. We sat in silence as Tom clicked through the files and then he froze. His face turned pale. "What?" I asked, barely able to get the word out. "Look," he said, his voice shaky. The screen showed us sitting by the fire last night, but behind us, just outside the light, there was someone. A figure standing in the shadows. We didn't see them at the time. I replayed the memory in my mind, trying to remember if I had noticed anything. But no, it was just us, or so I thought. We watched in horror as the figure moved closer. The firelight flickered, and they stayed just out of sight. But there they were, watching us. The video kept playing, and the figure got even closer, then disappeared behind our tent. The rest of the video showed nothing else, just us going to sleep, unaware. "Who is that?" I whispered, panic rising in my chest. Tom didn't answer. He shut the laptop, his hands shaking. "We need to go, now." We started packing, throwing everything into our bags as fast as we could. My heart was racing, and I felt like someone was watching us right then. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, sent my mind spinning, and then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the trees. Tom grabbed my hand, and we stood frozen, listening. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence again. Then, closer this time, we heard the sound of someone walking through the brush. I couldn't breathe. We weren't alone. We didn't even finish packing. We just grabbed what we could and started running toward the car. But the footsteps followed. They weren't fast, but they didn't stop. I kept looking back, expecting to see someone or something behind us, but I saw nothing. We reached the car, threw our stuff inside, and just as Tom was about to start the engine, I saw it. At the edge of the trees, there was a figure, standing still, watching us. It was the same person from the video, the same shadow that had circled our tent. Tom, I couldn't even finish the sentence. He looked up, his face pale, and saw it too. But before he could turn the key, the laptop in my lap made a noise, a soft beep. The screen flickered, and then it went black. The battery had died. Our only proof gone. We sat there for a moment, staring at the figure. They didn't move. They just stood there, like they knew we had nowhere to go. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't tell if Tom was breathing. We were trapped, too scared to move, too terrified to leave the car. The figure didn't come any closer, but it didn't go away either. It just stood, like it was waiting. I don't know how long we sat there, paralyzed by fear. I don't even remember how we eventually got out of there. But I do know this. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal, and it wasn't some harmless park ranger. Someone had been watching us the entire time, and I don't think we were ever meant to leave. I haven't been camping since. I don't know why we thought this hike was a good idea. Maybe because it was supposed to be simple, just two friends, a weekend getaway to the woods. Nothing complicated. We planned to hike to a remote campsite, spend the night, and head back. It was supposed to be peaceful, just nature, no phones, no work. But now, as we walked deeper into the forest, the path got quieter. Too quiet. I checked my phone. No signal. Ben laughed when I showed him the screen. "We knew this would happen," he said, but I could hear a bit of unease in his voice too. It was fine at first, but the further we walked, the more isolated it felt. The trees were thick, blocking out most of the sunlight. Long shadows stretched across the trail, making everything feel darker than it should have been. And then I realized we hadn't seen anyone else for hours. "Shouldn't there be more people around?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Ben shrugged, though I could tell he was thinking the same thing. He pulled out the map, frowning at it. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," he muttered, but neither of us really believed that. We kept walking until we stumbled upon something strange. In a small clearing off the path, there was a tent. It looked old and abandoned. I don't know why, but my stomach twisted when I saw it. There wasn't supposed to be anyone here, and yet this tent had been here for a while. We approached it, cautious. The fabric was torn in places, and as we got closer, we noticed something that made my blood run cold. Bloodstains. On the tent. Not a lot, but enough to make us stop in our tracks. "Maybe someone got hurt," I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. We looked around. No one was there. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave a tent, blood, and everything like this? Ben crouched down, examining the ground. "There's more over here," he said, pointing to some belongings scattered in the dirt. A backpack, half open, its contents spilled. A sleeping bag, torn and dirty. And then a knife. It was covered in dried blood. We stared at it for what felt like forever. My heart was racing now, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my forehead. "We should leave," I whispered. Suddenly, very aware of how quiet the forest was around us. "We can't just leave. What if someone needs help?" Ben said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. He was trying to stay rational, but everything about this felt wrong. Every instinct I had was telling me to get out, to run. But Ben was right too. What if someone had been hurt? What if they were nearby, needing help? We argued for a few minutes, whispering, our voices tense. I wanted to leave. He wanted to stay, to look around. In the end, he convinced me to take a closer look at the tent. The air felt thick, heavy, as we got closer to the bloodstains. Inside, it was even worse. More blood, more signs of a struggle, but no people. Whoever had been here was long gone. My hands were shaking as I turned to leave. Then we heard it. Footsteps coming from the trees behind us. Slow, deliberate. My heart stopped. We both froze, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but we couldn't see anyone. It was as if the forest was playing tricks on us. The footsteps grew louder, but still, there was no one there. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, though I knew he did. He nodded, his face pale. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sound of someone or something moving through the trees, getting closer. But we couldn't see a thing. "Let's go," Ben finally said, his voice barely audible. We grabbed our stuff, trying to act calm, but panic was building inside me. The footsteps followed us as we started walking back toward the trail. Slowly at first, then faster. My pulse was pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short gasps, but every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there. "Run," I heard Ben say, and that's when we started sprinting. We didn't care about the trail anymore. We just needed to get away from that tent, from whatever was following us. The footsteps followed, closer now, faster, but still, we couldn't see anyone. My mind was racing. Was this real? Was someone actually out there, or were we imagining it? But no, the sound was too clear, too close. Something was out there. Suddenly, Ben tripped. He went down hard, his backpack spilling out over the dirt. I stopped, reaching down to help him, my hands trembling. "Get up," I whispered, my voice shaky. I could hear the footsteps again, louder this time, right behind us. He scrambled to his feet and we took off again, but it was too late. Just as we started to run, we heard it. Heavy breathing, coming from the trees behind us. We turned, just in time to hear the snap of branches. Something was moving toward us, but before I could see what it was, everything went black. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, it was morning, and we were still in the forest, lying in the dirt. Ben was next to me, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Neither of us spoke as we gathered our things and ran, not stopping until we reached the car. We never talked about it after that. But I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps, or the way the forest felt that night, like it was alive, like it was watching us. I still wonder who or what was out there. But some questions are better left unanswered. I took my dog Bruno on a camping trip last weekend. It was something I'd been planning for a while, just me, him, and the woods. I needed some time away from everything, and it seemed like a perfect idea. No phones, no people, just peace. Bruno loves the outdoors, always running around, sniffing everything like it's all new to him, even if we've been to the same trail 100 times. I thought it would be good for both of us. The first day was perfect. We hiked for hours, and when we found a spot by a small clearing, I set up the tent and built a fire. Bruno was happy, his tail wagging the whole time. It felt safe, the kind of quiet that makes you think nothing bad can happen. We ate some food, sat by the fire, and by the time the sun went down, I was already feeling sleepy. Bruno curled up next to me in the tent, and we both fell asleep fast. At some point in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. It wasn't cold, and there wasn't any noise that I could remember. Just that strange feeling, like something was wrong. I reached over to where Bruno usually slept, but my hand landed on nothing. "Bruno?" I whispered, still half asleep. Nothing. I sat up, rubbing my eyes and looking around. The tent was zipped up, no way he could have gotten out. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to freak out. Maybe he had pushed his way through and wandered off, chasing a rabbit or something. I called his name again, this time louder, but still no sound. Stepping out into the night, I grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but everything was so still. The fire had burned out and the woods were quiet, too quiet. I walked a few steps, shining the light around, trying to spot Bruno's brown fur. Then I saw something that made my stomach twist. Footprints. Not dog prints, human footprints. They circled my tent, slowly, as if someone had been walking around me, watching. My heart started to race. I crouched down to get a better look, touching the ground. The prints were fresh. I hadn't walked around the tent at all since I set it up. These weren't mine. I stood up, feeling dizzy, my chest tightening. Where was Bruno? And who had been here while I slept? I scanned the area with the flashlight again, but there was no sign of him, no movement at all. Just those footprints and the quiet. I walked a little further from the tent, calling out for Bruno. My voice sounded too loud in the silence, like it didn't belong. I could feel panic building up inside me, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was someone passing by, I told myself. Maybe they didn't mean any harm, just curious. But why would they walk around my tent in the middle of the night? Why didn't they say anything? I followed the footprints a little, but they seemed to go in circles, like whoever it was didn't have any direction. Just walking, watching. I felt eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. My hand was shaking, and I could barely hold the flashlight steady. Bruno was still nowhere to be found, and I was starting to think something had happened to him. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound from the bushes. It was soft, barely there, but enough to send my heart pounding in my ears. I turned the light toward the noise, my breath catching in my throat. "Bruno?" I whispered, hoping, praying it was him, but there was nothing. The bushes stopped moving, and everything was still again. I walked closer, the flashlight beam flickering on a piece of cloth stuck in a branch. It was torn, dirty, but not from anything I had brought. It didn't look like it belonged to Bruno either. I picked it up, holding it in my hand. That's when I saw more footprints. They led away from the tent, deeper into the woods. My first thought was to follow them, to find Bruno, but something inside me screamed not to. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. Whoever had been here was still close, maybe watching me from the shadows. My body froze, caught between wanting to run and not knowing where to go. I stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, holding the torn cloth and trying to think. What should I do? Should I pack up and leave? But where would I go in the middle of the night, out here, alone? I didn't even know what direction to start walking in. And what if they were still out there, waiting? I slowly backed up toward the tent, keeping the flashlight pointed at the trees. My throat was dry, my heart beating so fast it hurt. Every little sound made me jump, branches creaking, leaves rustling, but I couldn't tell if they were real or just in my head. Back in the tent, I zipped it up quickly, grabbing the small knife I had brought with me. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I sat there, clutching it, staring at the tent door, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the morning to come, though it felt like it never would. Every few minutes, I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft, slow, like they were testing to see if I was still awake. I kept holding my breath, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. The knife felt heavy in my hand, but I didn't let go. By the time the first light of dawn finally started to break through the tent walls, I was still sitting there, wide awake, my body stiff and aching. I never found Bruno. I never saw who made those footprints, but I know I wasn't alone that night. I wasn't scared at first. I mean, it was just a game, right? It was supposed to be fun. We were a group of 6, all friends from high school, out in the woods at night playing hide and seek like we were still kids. It was Max's idea. He said the darkness would make it more exciting. At first, I laughed along with everyone else, feeling a rush of excitement as we scattered into the trees. I chose a spot far away from the others. It seemed smart at the time, like I'd be the last one found. The forest was quiet, too quiet. After a few minutes, the laughter and footsteps faded, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. I crouched behind a thick tree, trying not to make any noise. The woods were darker than I expected, and the moon barely gave any light. It was colder, too. My jacket felt too thin, and I started to shiver. Minutes passed, then maybe an hour. It was hard to tell. No one had found me yet, which was weird. I expected to hear someone calling out, yelling that they were caught or something, but there was nothing. I started to wonder if I had gone too far from the group. Maybe they were already done back at the start, and I was just sitting here like an idiot. I thought about giving up, standing up, and walking back to the campfire, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the creeping feeling that something wasn't right. It had been too long, way too long. Finally, I decided to go back. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my jeans. As I stepped forward, a branch snapped loudly under my foot, and I froze, heart racing for a moment. Stupid. It's just a branch, I told myself. Still, the silence was unsettling. There wasn't even the sound of crickets. Just nothing. I called out, "Max?" No answer. "Jenna?" Silence. I tried again, my voice shaking this time. "Guys?" Nothing. My stomach twisted. This wasn't funny anymore. I made my way through the trees, trying to find the spot where we started. As I walked, the woods felt even darker, like they were closing in around me. Every shadow looked like it was moving, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. I saw something up ahead, half hidden behind some bushes. As I got closer, my heart dropped. It was Jenna's backpack. It was lying on the ground, half open, with her stuff scattered around. That didn't make sense. She wouldn't just leave it like that. I looked around, calling her name again, louder this time. Still no response. I picked up her backpack, my hands shaking now. Where was everyone? I looked at the path ahead, trying to see if anyone else had passed through, but there was nothing, just more trees. I kept moving, faster now, trying not to think about what I had just found. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe they had all gone back to camp. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I found another hiding spot, or what I thought was one. It looked like someone had been here. There were footprints, broken branches, but no one was there anymore. Just more emptiness. I shouted again, but the sound of my voice was swallowed by the forest. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, like someone, or something, was moving through the trees not far from me. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned quickly, looking in every direction, but I couldn't see anything. I wasn't alone anymore. I took a step back, my legs feeling weak. The rustling stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I held my breath, not daring to move. My eyes darted around, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. Then, in the corner of my vision, I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, moving between the trees. I couldn't make out who or what it was, but it was coming toward me. Panic surged through me. And I ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away. The footsteps behind me grew louder, quicker. I could feel it. Whoever it was, they were following me. I stumbled over roots, branches scratching my face as I pushed through the underbrush. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they would give out, but I kept going. Eventually, I found a small clearing. I collapsed to the ground, trying to catch my breath. I glanced around, listening for the footsteps, but there was only silence. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Maybe whoever had been following me gave up. Maybe they were gone. But then, I saw movement again. My heart sank. A figure was approaching, slowly, carefully, stepping into the clearing. At first, I thought it was Max. Relief washed over me. Finally, I wasn't alone anymore. But as the figure came closer, I realized something was wrong. It wasn't Max. The shape was all wrong. The way it moved wasn't right. My throat tightened as I watched it step into the light of the clearing. It wasn't one of my friends. It was someone else. I tried to move, to scream, but my body wouldn't listen. The figure came closer, and I could finally see their face. Or rather, the lack of it. In the darkness, their features were blurred, but I knew, deep down, that I wasn't getting out of those woods. That's when I heard a voice, not theirs, but from deep inside my head, whispering, "You should have stayed hidden." The last thing I remember was the sound of my own breath, heavy, scared. And then, nothing. I've never really been the type to go camping alone. In fact, before last week, I'd never even thought about it. But life got too stressful, too fast. My job was killing me. My relationships were falling apart. I felt like everything was closing in, and I just needed a break from everything. So, when I saw a small secluded camping spot listed online, I thought, why not? A few days in the forest would do me some good. The place was perfect, at least on the surface. A quiet lake, surrounded by trees with no one else around. It was exactly what I needed. The first day, I set up my tent near the water, feeling proud that I was doing this all by myself. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the birds and the wind rustling through the trees. I could finally breathe again. For the first time in months, my mind was clear. The first night went by without any problems. I sat by the campfire, listening to the crackling of the wood, staring up at the stars. It felt good to be away from everything. I slept surprisingly well, the soft sounds of the lake lulling me to sleep. The second night was when things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. I was sitting by the fire again, watching the flames dance, when I noticed something strange. Footprints, not mine, in the dirt near my tent. I hadn't seen anyone else the whole time I'd been there. It didn't make sense, but I brushed it off. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them before. Maybe they were there from another camper who had been here a long time ago. I told myself not to worry. I was just being paranoid. I needed to relax. The next day, things got worse. I went for a hike, following a small trail that led deeper into the woods. Every now and then, I had this weird feeling, like someone was behind me, watching. I kept turning around, but there was no one there. When I got back to my camp, I noticed something strange. My backpack was moved. I was sure I'd left it next to my tent, but now it was lying a few feet away, half open. Some of my stuff was scattered on the ground, but nothing was missing. It was like someone had looked through my things but hadn't taken anything. That uneasy feeling came back, stronger this time. I considered leaving right then, but I didn't want to give up. This trip was supposed to be about getting away from stress, not creating more of it. So I convinced myself that I'd just misplaced my stuff. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the footprints weren't even fresh. I decided to stay, telling myself everything was fine. That evening, just as the sun was setting, I was sitting by the fire again, trying to shake off the weird vibes I'd been feeling all day. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, coming from the woods behind me. I froze. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, but then I heard a voice, calm and steady, from the shadows. "You're not alone, you know." I whipped around, and there he was. A man, standing just at the edge of the trees. He wasn't old, but not young either. Just a normal-looking guy, but the way he stood there, so casually, like this was all normal, made my blood run cold. He took a few steps closer, his face illuminated by the light of the fire. He smiled, but there was something off about it. It wasn't friendly. It was knowing. "I've been watching you," he said, "for days now." My heart pounded in my chest. What did he mean, watching me? I hadn't seen anyone else here. How long had he been out there, hiding in the trees while I went about my day, completely unaware? I tried to keep my voice steady, asking him what he wanted, why he was following me. But he didn't answer. Instead, he just kept talking, like this was a casual conversation, like it was normal to admit to stalking someone in the woods. "You seem like you needed some company," he said, his tone light, almost playful. I stood up slowly, trying to keep my distance without looking like I was running. My mind raced. What was he going to do? Should I make a run for it? But he didn't move. He just watched me, still smiling, as if he was enjoying my fear. I tried to keep him talking, asking him more questions, trying to figure out what he wanted, but his answers were vague, cryptic, like he was playing some kind of game. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness like he'd never been there at all. I stood there, staring into the forest, my heart still racing. What the hell just happened? Should I pack up and leave? But it was already dark, and the thought of walking through the woods at night terrified me even more. I decided to stay, but I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every rustle of the leaves made me jump. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe sometimes. In the morning, I found my tent slashed open. My things were scattered all over the place, like someone had torn through them in a rage. The man was gone, but the fear wasn't. I packed up my stuff as fast as I could and left. I didn't look back. I wish I could say the fear stayed behind in that forest, but it didn't. Even now, weeks later, I still feel like I'm being watched, like he's still out there, waiting, watching.